Hey everybody, welcome back to this study of church history. This week week two, we're looking at the Reformation in Germany, which is in a lot of ways seen by some at least to be sort of the birthplace of the Protestant Reformation. Although as we'll note, as we've mentioned before, this is more than just one movement. This is really a series of movements trying to reform Catholicism, and in a way these different reformers and reform movements are sort of all lumped into the same category, talking about the Protestant Reformation. And certainly what we're going to do, at least in part, this week is talk a lot about Martin Luther and Lutheranism as well, at least at the time that Martin Luther lived. So we have a few things that we want to talk about this week, three main things at least. The first one's going to take a little bit longer. And certainly with the reading that you had, some of this should be familiar to you, possibly also in filling in some gaps maybe that the book didn't get into. But the three things that we want to look at this week, primarily we want to first talk about the life of Martin Luther. Then we want to talk about Luther's theology and mainly the beliefs that Luther had. And some of these beliefs that Luther had also you can still see today in some denominations. And then we're going to talk about Lutheranism after Luther, not necessarily talk in great detail about Lutheranism today, although we may mention a couple of things about Lutheranism today at the end. But that's sort of the plan going forward. So we begin by talking about the life of Martin Luther. We're first going to talk sort of do like an introduction to Luther, at least how people see Luther, because depending on who you are, you probably view Martin Luther in a little bit different light, especially back then. There were a lot of different opinions about Martin Luther. We're going to talk about what I just call the road to Wittenberg, Germany. And Wittenberg, if you've read, you know that that's connected to the 95 Theses, which we'll talk a little bit about as well. And then finally, in this section, we're going to talk about Luther's protection, or the fact that Luther, because his beliefs and what he's putting out are so different from the church in some ways that he creates enemies, and thus he needs protection. And he's actually going to find protection within some of the territories of Germany where he's from. So as we begin talking about Luther, again, there are a lot of people that debate the character of Martin Luther, the magnitude of him. Certainly he's a very important individual to talk about, but just how important is he? When it comes to the character of his legacy, obviously the viewpoint matters, right? Do you come, if you come from a Catholic background at the time, maybe a Catholic background today, maybe you have one view of Martin Luther versus those that are in other denominations of Christianity, probably have a lot different outlook on Martin Luther. There's no doubt, though, he was a very passionate man. He strongly believed in what he thought. He was very outspoken at times in his life about what he thought, which are qualities that are generally good to have about yourself. But when it comes to the viewpoint about his character, there were some that would suggest that Martin Luther, what he was he was a destroyer of unity. The unity that was in Europe, at least under Catholicism, while there are issues with it at the time, you could still say that in large part Europe was under the banner of Catholicism, and that's that was what Christianity was at that point. It was unified, if you look at it that way. There's some that may look at Martin Luther as, again, being the one who destroyed that unity. There are others, though, that would say that Martin Luther was a hero because he undid some of the problems, or was finally successful, we might can say, in pointing out some of the problems of Catholicism, and based on his success, he sort of undermined what some may call a religiously tyrannical situation, where the Pope would be sort of the tyrant, right? In that light, some back then would have viewed him certainly in that light, as we'll see in a moment. You also could sort of view Martin Luther as a man that was like a traveler that, was on his way to the right goal, but didn't quite get far enough with where he wanted to go. And obviously that'll become a theme as we move forward. People that looked at Luther as a very important individual, but some might think that he might not got far enough down the road that he needed to get to the end too, we might could say. So his character, that's something that you want to think about, something that you want to consider as well. You also think about the legacy that Martin Luther behind. Right? There's some people that sort of portray this idea that, without Luther, you don't have the Reformation at all. Right? If you don't have Luther, there's no creator of it. It never takes off like it does. And so what this is called sometimes is called great man histories, where one individual sets in motion a lot of different events that today have historical importance. Well, we'll point out that Luther is obviously a very important man, but there were several things that aided him, that actually helped him be successful. And we've talked about some of these before, but it is worth mentioning again. We think about the importance of the printing press, and by the time that Martin Luther lived, the printing press at this point not only was used by scholars, but also was used to disseminate writings among the people. Very important moving forward. We again have talked about the nationalism that's developing in Europe, and particularly in Germany. The nationalism within several of the minor territories of Germany is going to be a motivating factor to support Luther because of his stand against the papacy. And as we've mentioned, I think last time in week 1, we talked about the Ottoman Turks and how Charles V, who was the emperor of Germany during part of Martin Luther's life, had the opportunity to sort of squash Luther and his followers, but his attention was more devoted towards fending off the Ottoman Turks from Germany in the southeast. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So we might could say that the stars had aligned for Luther. So he had a lot of things that helped him, that made him successful compared to John Huss or John Wycliffe. But nevertheless, Luther needed to act, obviously, right? You don't accomplish anything if you don't act, and Luther, of course, had the courage to act. So that's a little bit about an introduction to Luther. Let's talk about the road to Wittenberg, and we begin again by keeping in mind what Luther, where Luther started off with. And one thing that you note about Martin Luther is that he was born into a household that was very strict. I've got the date there. He was born in 1483 in Eisleben, Germany. His father came from poverty. His father had essentially worked his way up in life. He began as a miner, and then by the time I believe that his life ended, or at least by the time Martin Luther had become an adult, Luther's father had owned several mines. So he really worked his way up. Now later in life, Martin Luther would look back on his home life in a very negative sense. Again, his father was very strict. In school, he dealt with very strict teachers. He would write about later that the punishment was so severe from his parents and from his teachers early on that it would even draw blood. So he had a very negative outlook on his home life. And that's something that we'll talk about with some of these reformers going forward. We had that question about, your personal experiences. How does that develop your religious outlook? Well, we're going to see with Martin Luther that his personal experiences probably had a tremendous effect on how he viewed not just Christianity, but also how he viewed God as well. And certainly because of Luther's very strict home life, there are times throughout his life where he obviously dealt with anxiety, depression, and things of that nature. And that strict household actually motivated him to join a monastery in some ways. So in 1505, there was an occasion where Luther was traveling. He faced a very powerful thunderstorm, and he essentially prayed to one of the saints of the Catholic Church that if he was preserved, if he was saved from the storm, that he would devote himself to the church by becoming a monk. And sometimes traumatic events like that can motivate people to make decisions like that. And obviously Luther was preserved. He becomes a monk consequently. And so that the thunderstorm that he experienced was something that motivated him to join a monastery. But it also could be that his home life as well. Again, that harsh upbringing that he had. In Luther's mind, he sort of resented his father the more that he got older. In fact, Luther's father wanted Luther to become a lawyer and sent him to school to become a lawyer. But Luther did not have any desire to do that, probably in part because he didn't like his father. Luther instead wanted to find something else to do in life, and for him that was to become a monk, which, even though, you know, in a spiritual sense, that type of profession or that type of occupation would have been, you know, you would have commended an individual for making that step. But when it came to Luther, he was more concerned. He had a great concern about his own salvation, which is certainly good. And that part with his home life drove him to be a monk, because that was one of the ways in which people sometimes made sure that their salvation was clear, because being a monk, you're around the Bible, you're around Scripture, you're around other monks, people that have that same task. Generally, even though we've talked about the situation at this point where some of these monasteries have become places of leisure, to some it was still seen as a way to learn more about God and obviously be more connected, more sure about your salvation. Certainly, Luther's father didn't like this, because he wanted Luther to become a lawyer, become wealthy. But that's not what Luther chose at all. And that upbringing is going to come out a little bit more as we move on. Now, when it came to Luther and his experiences in the monastery, Luther, over the course of time, proved that he had very great abilities. Reading ability, the ability to understand, communicating, so much so that the person in charge, the head individual within the monastery, suggested that Luther should work to become a priest. And that's what he was on his way to do, was to become a priest. However, as Luther lived in a monastery, he had this one reoccurring problem that he seemed to always have come up, and we can call this Luther's terror. And this terror was actually his perception of God. Luther lived in a monastery. He was not thought of as a bad individual. If you had to go and survey, more than likely, from what we understand, Luther would have been thought of as a very good individual by his peers. That would have been his reputation. But yet, Luther still wrestled with his concern about salvation. And in Luther's mind, what he was struggling with was the fact that he did not think that he had at that point done enough to earn his salvation from God. And some historians have pointed out that Luther's conception of God was more so a severe judge, some individual that's looking to find mistakes, some individual that is not willing to forgive, that is looking for the smallest thing to not forgive. And that was Luther's sort of perspective of God. He was always concerned about the wrath of God. And you almost wonder if Luther's upbringing at home, where he had a father that was very strict, that was very demanding, you almost wonder if when Luther got to this point in life, that his conception of God, he often thought about his own father. And that shaped his outlook about who God was. And there's a point right there, you know, if you're a parent, you think about your example that you set as a Christian, and obviously that's important. But we often don't think that sometimes, children who are sort of growing and learning more about Christianity, sometimes their conception, the traits that they attribute from God, they may develop that mindset based on what they see in their parents. Obviously, after all, God is referred to as our Father. If we're a Christian, God's referred to as our Father. And so that's something for parents to think about. You're not just setting an example for how to live for Christ, but your children's conception of the very idea about the characteristics of God, they may wind up developing the idea of those traits based on the example that you set behind. That certainly was the case for Luther. And so, in light of this feeling that he had not done enough, Luther was always concerned about doing enough, trying to find everything possible to obtain God's grace, so that way he felt that his salvation was assured. But the more that Luther kept figuring out more ways to try to earn God's grace, the more Luther felt that he fell deeper into sin. So it seems like he couldn't overcome the problem. And the very process of the church, right? What would be called the sacrament of penance, the idea that you go before a priest and you confess your sins. Didn't matter how many times Luther did that, he always felt like he had not done enough. And based on that, Luther had these problems, but he also communicated it to those that were sort of above him in the monastery. And so one of the person that he confessed his sins to actually told Luther to look into some of these writers that had been writing what later we sort of know to be what's later been called sort of the Middle Age mystics of Christianity. And Luther's what would be Luther's confessor, or the person that he confessed his sins to, told him to do this. And some of these teachers had essentially just taught a simple message that at the end of the day, God is love, and that the only thing you need to do in order to have salvation is that you only need to, quote unquote, love God. In theory, this would be difficult for Luther to do, right? Because Luther's conception was to focus on all of his sins. And when you think about the idea of finding love in Luther's conception of God, who's this unforgiving judge, that's very hard for him to do. His fathers and teachers, again, would punish him for the smallest mistake. That was his conception of God. And so if God, in his mind, was like those teachers and fathers, then how in the world can you justify having love for something that doesn't seem to have your best interest at all, or doesn't seem to offer you any mercy? So that was hard for Luther to try to wrap his mind around. And so this actually, as you might have guessed, this ultimately fails. Doesn't provide any comfort to Luther. So at that point, you would think that maybe the person that Luther confesses his sins to, the person, maybe some people that are over him in the monastery, they might advise him to, sort of dial it back, go into, a place of solitary confinement, not like prison or anything, but just to study more, to try to learn more, to overcome those issues that he was having. Instead, they actually convinced Luther to become a teacher, which again is very interesting because of Luther's struggles. Generally, somebody who struggles with something, of a religious nature, you wouldn't think that individual would need to be teaching a Bible class or preaching sermons or anything like that. But that was actually their way of handling it, was that Luther becomes a teacher. And this is actually going to benefit Luther in terms of finding an answer to the question about trying to make sure that his salvation was sure. And the position that he took was a professor's place there at the university in Wittenberg. This is 1512 AD, by the way, that he takes this position. Teaching's actually, again, going to benefit Luther's struggle. He's going to find an answer to his problems. And so you think about there are two particular books that helped Luther out, that he studied and that he taught. Obviously, when you have to teach something, you've got to know it a lot more, or you're supposed to know the subject material probably a lot more than those that you're teaching. Well, when it came to the book of Psalms, Luther had already known the book of Psalms very well. Every year that in every event where they had things like Christmas or Easter, the celebrations of the Catholic Church, Lent, Advent, things like that, sometimes the Psalms were recited then, and Luther knew them very well. But Luther, as he began to study the Psalms more, started to see the Psalms more so as Christ speaking of himself in the Psalms, more so than he had before. Now, we understand that some of the Psalms are messianic in nature, and if you take a class on the Psalms, you'll learn which ones those are. But it's almost as though with many of these Psalms that Luther saw Christ speaking in them. Which, again, not some Psalms are messianic, but others are not. And he began to find consolation in his own suffering with sin as he sees the suffering of Christ that he sees in the book of Psalms. And this helps him out a little bit in terms of comfort, but the real turning point is when he taught the book of Romans. And this teaching the book of Romans was in 1515 AD. 1515 AD. And if you know anything about Martin Luther, you know that the book of Romans is very important to him. This is where he begins to get the idea of salvation by faith alone, was in his study of the book of Romans. So for Luther, the answer to his struggles was found in Romans chapter 1, verse 17. Now, if you don't have a Bible with you, I would encourage you to pause the video at this point and come back when you have a Bible, because I'm going to pull out a few passages of Scripture to look at for a moment. So Romans 1 verses 16 and 17, I know Brother Jared, I think, teaches Romans class. He points out that really if you want to know what the book of Romans is about, it's sort of summed up in verses 16 and 17 in a large part. Right, so Romans 1:16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to every one that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Right, so the connection between the gospel and its importance to salvation. Well, verse 17 was very important for Luther. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. Now, we'll talk more when we talk about Luther's theology about exactly what he thought on this verse. But at this point, Luther had to wrestle with the question about what is the righteousness of God. What is the righteousness of God, right? So the gospel, again, being the good news of salvation. By it, at this point, from what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 1, the gospel is... the gospel is the means to salvation. So for Luther, how could the gospel be the revelation of the righteousness of God? Because in Luther's mind, when he thought about the righteousness of God, it was always connected to God's need to punish sinners. Again, that was his perspective of God. God's need to punish sinners. But as he taught the book of Romans, he began to see the aspect of the righteousness of God. And that changes the way that he taught Romans, and that begins to change his outlook on God. And we'll talk more about this in a minute, but what he ultimately comes to the conclusion is that the righteousness of God is given by God because he wishes to do it. Not that man has done anything of himself to get over the problem of sin. It's not because man has met the demands that divine justice it's not that man has met the needs that divine justice requires for man to get the righteousness of God. It's just something that God has given because he wants to do it. And that verse and that very basic point is where the doctrine of faith, salvation by faith alone, will come from, as we'll note more when we talk about Martin Luther's theology. But it's there that he finds the answers to his problems, and that gives him confidence moving forward. But some of the conclusions that he's coming to are not the same as what the Catholic Church was teaching. Now, Luther actually wrote a set of theses, and these are not the 95, but these are another set of arguments. The word theses, thesis, or its plural form, theses, is just another word for argument. So you can say Luther's first arguments. These are only going to be circulated among the professors there at Wittenberg. Luther at this time, and this is important to note that Luther early on, all he was looking at, all he was thinking about was that he was actually just trying to make changes within the Catholic Church rather than starting something new. And so Luther doesn't necessarily see the full weight of what he's talking about until later on in terms of how dramatic of an impact it would be. But Luther's ideas, he thought it would be interesting to share them with the professors. But one thing that he figured out is that he actually didn't create much of a stir among those that he worked with. These were arguments that were supposed to be debated in a scholarly setting, but the professors didn't necessarily want to do that. Part of that is that Luther actually shared some ideas. Some of the things that he thought were sort of somewhat shared among some of these professors, but it doesn't generate the debate that Luther thought it would. So now this is where later on Luther decides to amend these theses, and this is the famous part about the 95 theses that he develops, that he will nail to the door of the church in Wittenberg. So let's talk about the motivation behind this. And if you notice, the book talked about the sale of indulgences. Let's talk about this situation a little bit more in depth, at least what was going on. So in Germany at the time, this is very important to what was going on in Germany is very important to understand why Luther was so motivated to talk about why the sale of indulgences were a problem. So in Germany, you had really an ongoing, I won't say discussion, but you have an ongoing situation between Pope Leo X and Albert of Brandenburg. Albert's family was basically in the process of trying to consolidate its power in Germany, at least to gain influences. And again, you've got an emperor over Germany, or the Holy Roman Empire, but you also have princes over different regions within that empire. And so some of these princes at times try to gain more power by taking over other regions. And so what Albert was trying to do was basically buy bishops' offices in other regions within Germany to sort of get control of those territories. And so Albert decides to strike up a deal with the Pope to buy the Archbishop's office, which was the most important seat within Germany. And he's able to do that for about 10,000 ducats, which at that point, ducat, I believe, is a measure of weight. So depending on whether it was silver or gold, it was an extremely large amount of money. And so they strike a deal, and Albert of Brandenburg is able to pay that much money to buy the Archbishop's office because he's trying to consolidate his power. So as part of this agreement, the Pope decides to tell Albert that there is a great sale of indulgences in his territories. And as we talked about, indulgences, again, were payments made for the forgiveness of sin. So the Pope wanted Albert to announce to his people that there's this great sale where people can get a good price, essentially, to make payments for their sins. Half of the proceeds are not just going to go to Germany, or to the different churches in Germany, but half of those proceeds are going to go to the papacy, to the Pope, to Rome, because Leo X wanted to improve the buildings that were there in Rome. And in particular, he wanted to finish completion of what's today known as St. Peter's Basilica, which is one of the most famous churches that you can visit in Rome. We might look at a picture of that a little bit later. And so basically you have these, behind closed door meetings going on where Albert's cutting a deal to gain more power within Germany, and the Pope is looking to get more wealth to help build up Rome. And so in the process of that, John Tetzel was sort of commissioned to be the salesman, the head salesman for these indulgences in Germany. And he was an excellent salesman at that. He came up with some very, very witty slogans, we might could say. They developed the saying while he was there that, if you paid for these indulgences, you would be cleaner than Adam was before the fall in the Garden of Eden. Your sins would be gone when you put your money in the coffer. You could figuratively hear the soul springing from purgatory if you made the payments on these indulgences. And Tetzel was a very excellent salesman within that. However, some of the humanists and scholars that were in Germany, again, saw this as the Pope and the Catholic Church sort of, not only misrepresenting the doctrine of what Christianity should be, but also at the same time interfering in the business of German politics. Some humanists and scholars talked about how this promoted superstition, ignorance among the people because of the corruption in their teachings. Those that would be considered nationalists at this point in Germany saw this again as the Pope and the Church getting involved where it should not be. But the humanists and scholars, the German nationalists, while they don't agree with this, they're not very outspoken about this displeasure about what's going on with the Pope, with Albert, and with John Tetzel. Luther, on the other hand, is going to be a lot more outspoken about this. And this is where the 95 Theses come in, because in large part they're going to address the sale of indulgences. Now, Luther here is not just saying that buying these indulgences is ineffective. He goes a lot further beyond that, trying to get at the question of why did the Catholic Church need to be dependent on this form of income, right? His point would be basically, if the Pope has the power to free souls from purgatory, if he has the power to grant that, then why in the world do people need to be paying for that privilege, right? If the Pope is supposed to be a representative of God, who, 1 John 4, God is referred to as love. If the Pope is is a representative of God, why does he not just do this for free if it's within his power? Why is he charging money to be able to do this? If the Pope really cared about the common Christian, why would he be so willing to allow these, especially poorer Christians, to basically sell themselves into poverty when he could just simply grant the forgiveness for free? Was Luther's point. Now, the Theses, again, they were posted on October the 31st, 1517 in Wittenberg, Germany, which you might want to know this date because a lot of people sort of see this date as the official beginning of the Protestant Reformation, which it's a little bit more complicated answer than that. But if you want to keep a date in mind about when did the Protestant Reformation begin, a lot of people are going to point to August the 31st or October the 31st, 1517. Now, the thing about this is that Luther only posted these in Latin, which again was the language of the church. However, there were some individuals that took what he wrote and decided to translate it into German, and that way it circulated among the people, and that's where Luther's ideas began to take off. And again, this is important because 100 years, 1439 when it was first invented, only scholars were using the printing press. But by the time Luther has come along with books and other works being translated into the common language, Luther's ideas circulate a lot better because more people can actually read, because it's being translated into the common language rather than just staying in Latin. And so as a result of this, Luther drew the anger of some church officials. He would go on to offer a little bit more explanation once this first wave of anger came at him. But the Pope decided that since Luther, who was a member of the Augustinian order, you don't have to remember that, but Luther was a member of the Augustinian order, the Pope wanted that to be settled in-house, basically to get Luther to stop teaching this. However, there were other monks that were in Luther's order. Most of them actually agreed with what Luther said. And so the problem doesn't get settled at all. And Luther, again, being a very outspoken man, very firm about what he believed, would not be quiet about this. And so it's where we come to Luther's protection. Luther was put on trial for what he had taught. The Pope's representative that was to try him was a man named Thomas Cajetan, and his last name is spelled for you there. But Luther is actually not given a fair trial at all. In the process of the trial, he doesn't get a chance to explain himself. He doesn't get a chance to further defend what he has said. He's just basically told that he has to recant, or otherwise he's going to be in trouble. Luther would not recant. And so he basically, at this point, Luther goes back to Wittenberg, Germany, his home region, that area, and he's actually under the protection of the prince. The prince, whose name is Frederick the Wise, that we'll talk about in a moment, the prince actually allowed Luther to come under his protection because he wanted Luther to have a fair trial. If Luther was found guilty and still wouldn't recant, the prince would have been, okay with the punishment being administered. But the prince didn't feel like Luther got a fair trial. That's why he welcomes him back, and he wants Luther to be able to have a fair trial. However, this is where the politics in Germany play into Luther's favor. The same prince that welcomes him back is the same prince that the Pope had essentially been looking at as the next candidate to be promoted to being the next emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which again at this point is Germany. And so as a result, the Pope can't necessarily go all out on trying to attack and figure out where Luther is at and to bring him in, because he doesn't want to ruin that reputation with the prince. And so for a while there's essentially a truce that's been drawn where Luther can't really be attacked or drug out and forced into a trial. So all of this, while it's going on, Luther is winning over people. He's winning over politicians in Germany that have become upset with the amount that the Catholic Church has, and particularly the Pope, the amount of influence that he's having in Germany. He's obviously winning over people with his actual beliefs, and in that point, he's effective in that, convincing people of his beliefs. But he's also winning over these nationalists. He's also winning over the humanists, many of the humanists in Germany, because they have noted that some of the policies of the Catholic Church that they are, that they, as we mentioned before, that they're only hurting the common person, and it's only going to benefit the Pope and benefit the Catholic Church to waste money on these things that are not necessary in Rome. And so Luther is winning over people to his side while all of these things are going on. He's essentially exposing a lot of problems within the church that maybe the humanist scholars and some of these German nationalists haven't been quite as bold to talk about at this point. That's where we come to with the next section with Charles V and Luther. The prince that the Pope had in mind that was sort of Luther's protector, he doesn't become the next emperor. It's actually Charles V. who becomes the next emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And the thing about Charles is that he is a very staunch Catholic. He actually was the king of Spain. He also, when he's promoted to being the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, he gains that title as well. We've talked about Spain before. We've talked about the Spanish Inquisition, about how the Spanish nation developed alongside Catholicism consolidating control in Spain. And so those the monarchy of Spain and the Catholic Church are very much tied together. And so a lot of Spanish kings and queens are very hardcore, staunch Catholics. That fits the description of who Charles V was. In fact, it was his grandmother. His grandmother was actually Isabella. If you remember, it was one of those that instigated the Spanish Inquisition. This obviously put him at odds with Luther, because Charles V didn't want to have anything to do or hear about this idea of needing to change some things within the church. This actually puts him on the side of the Pope as well, and gives the Pope the ability to actually pursue after Martin Luther. And Luther, and at that point, the Pope decides to issue a papal bull, which is just a formal decree from the Pope concerning Martin Luther. That basically his teachings, his writings, all of those things had to be burned. Not only himself, but those that claimed to be his followers, that they had to recant or face excommunication. Basically given a time frame of about 60 days for people to be able to do this, to burn his works and to recant and submit to Roman authorities or face excommunication. Some of his reformers did. But Luther instead decides to burn the papal bull as a way of defiance. And at that point, one could point out that at that point, there was no going back for Luther to Catholicism, and that's maybe a point where we could draw out that maybe Luther and his followers are beginning to see, there's no hope at this point of changing Catholicism. We've got to start over in a large way. Nevertheless, obviously this act angered the Pope. It angered Charles V. Luther was basically brought before Charles V at a trial at Worms, which is a city. Basically, what happened in that trial was that Charles V told Luther to recant his beliefs. But Luther actually said that he wanted some time to think about that, and Charles V gave him time. And so Luther waited a day. He came back the next day and said that he refused to recant what he believed, and he talked about how what the Catholic Church was doing was harming the people of Germany by some of the Pope's policies. And this further angered the emperor. And so it seemed like Luther was on the verge of being put to death. Well, enter in the prince that had defended Luther before, Frederick the Wise. Frederick the Wise had organized a group of men to kidnap Luther, to take him away into hiding. And the place that he would be going to would be a place called Wartburg Castle. And the spelling on that is Wartburg. Wartburg Castle. It's actually going to be here that Luther creates a German translation of the Bible, one of the first to do it. Now, while he's in exile, those that still believed in what Luther taught, they were still at work. And it's at this point where you begin to see some of these churches in Germany actually implement some of Luther's ideas. More so, before this, Luther had just been talking about it, but you hadn't seen any his ideas implemented. Well, while Luther's in exile, some of his followers are going to implement some of his teachings within the church because of Luther's prominence within Germany. Some of those things would include conducting worship in German rather than in Latin, not offering Mass for the dead, which Luther thought was ineffective. There we go. So, in addition to that, Charles V had several reasons why he could not go after Luther while Luther was at Wartburg Castle. We've mentioned a couple of these before, but some of these are at least one or two of these are going to be new. So one thing that Charles V had to deal with when it came to Martin Luther at that time was the King of France. Not so much that the King of France was interested in Martin Luther, more so than it was that the King of France was looking to expand his territory, which would have included going into the Holy Roman Empire, or Germany. And for about the span of about 4 years, from 1521 to 1525, Charles V had to worry about holding back the King of France from taking territory from him. And Charles V is successful in that. However, once he defeats the King of France, he offers the King of France pardon. And the King of France turns on that. He actually forms an alliance with the Pope. After he's fought 4 years with Charles V, they form an alliance with Charles, or they form an alliance against Charles, and they declare war on the Holy Roman Empire. As a result, Charles V actually invades Rome, and Rome is sacked, and the Pope has to flee. And so this international problem with Charles V fending off and having to fight against the King of France and the Pope at this point and his forces, that's something else that's distracting him from Martin Luther. As we've mentioned before, the Ottoman Turks are still a force, a presence there in to the southeast of Germany that Charles V is having to worry about, making sure he has an army there to be able to protect Germany in case they're invaded. And to top all of it off, you've got peasant revolts, you've got strife among some of the nobility in Germany. You got a ton of problems that Charles V is having to deal with, and in his mind, Luther is the least of all of these problems. So he doesn't devote a lot of attention towards Luther for most of the 1520s, more so than he will later on. And so, in part because of all that, this gives Lutheranism a lot of space to grow. And you're going to see Lutheranism especially grow throughout northern Germany, and as we'll note in a little bit later on, throughout northern Europe. Now, I do want to mention, once this time is over with, this series of events, there are a few, again, diets. These are, again, religious and political meetings that were called and that had to deal with Luther and his followers. But I want to note a couple of them out. The 1526 Diet, these are the Diets of Speyer. That is S-P-E-I-E-R. S-P-E-I-E-R. You may see that spelled a little bit differently in some ways. But this is the first Diet of Speyer. 1526, this is where religious freedom was granted to most of the people in the German states. The only stipulation was that Lutheranism could not expand into new places where it had not been introduced. In 1529, the second Diet of Speyer, this is where the religious freedom was actually restricted. And as we've talked about in the first class, this is where the origin of the term Protestant comes from. The religious freedom was restricted at this point. But in 1530, you have the Diet of Augsburg. And this is where really at this point, it almost seemed like the Lutherans or the Protestants in Germany and the Catholics in Germany were basically on the verge of a civil war in terms of trying to gain control, religious control of Germany. And at this point, the Ottomans still posed a threat. Charles V recognized this. France was also still a lingering threat to the western border of Germany. And so Charles V recognized that he needs to settle this issue, and he decides, in conjunction with others, to with this diet to promote once again a policy of religious freedom, because Charles V needed both of these, needed Germany to be unified in order to fight off both of these threats if they decided to invade Germany. And that's where we will go ahead and leave it here with the life of Martin Luther. Again, hopefully the book filled in other parts. Maybe, hopefully this lecture filled in other parts so you have a little bit more complete understanding of Luther's life, at least in some of the work that he did. Well, that being said, we're going to go ahead and stop here. But thank you for your time and thank you for your attention. The next video, we'll talk about the theology or the beliefs of Martin Luther.